just get the infrastructure up and running. So this next talk is just to say a little bit about the actual collaboration that took part between the EODEM working group and the LIDO working group. I think I should say that when we started collaboration, the 1.1 draft had already been issued, and we could already see that there were elements in that that would be useful to us. So the addition of an element that lets us specify an application profile, as Regina was talking about in her talk, that means that we can say that this is specifically an EODEM document, and we can impose some additional restrictions to make sure that it works with systems designed to import an EODEM record. And we also noted the event object measurements element, which allows us to tie measurements to events related to the lending of the object. That was another introduction. But that does lead me to the first of the problems we encountered when we were mapping our requirements to LIDO, which was the definition of a measurement. So as currently defined, measurements in LIDO are measurements of the actual object, that is length, weight, height, etc. Physical measurements. And in our data standard, we do have this kind of measurement included alongside other information that identifies the object. But we also need to record different kinds of measurement. The names are abbreviated here on the slide. They should be temperature requirements they're held together in a group, relative humidity requirements, visible light exposure requirements, and ultraviolet light exposure requirements. So what we want to record are measurements that relate to the object's requirements, the conditions they need to be kept in to avoid damage and deterioration. And that is not something that you can physically measure from the object itself. Now, in this instance, the LIDO working group has agreed to extend the definition of measurements in version 1.1. In the current draft, these are listed against the measurement set element, and the significant addition is that this also covers environmental quantities such as relative humidity or light exposure assessed as object requirements. And they've also added a type attribute at the top level of a set of measurements, which allows us to distinguish between physical measurements and object requirements. So in this case, the LIDO working group kindly accommodated our needs by adapting a definition and adding an attribute in a new place. The second problem we encountered was a more sort of ontological one. LIDO places great emphasis on events which relate to an object, and these are defined as having dates, places, and actors. In other words, they are historic events. Will you just excuse me a moment? Sorry. So, events in LIDO are defined as having dates, places, and actors. In other words, they're historic events. But we want to tie our requirements to generic events, such as display, transport, etc., not just for one particular loan, but for any display or transport of the object. Now, when we discussed this with Regina, she and the LIDO working group were adamant that events were specific historical occurrences. However, the working group advised us that our events can be considered as historical occurrences if we conceive of them as being not the object's notional display, for example, but rather the assessment that took place to determine what its display requirements should be. So in this case, the LIDO working group helped us by explaining its definitions within the explicit context of our needs. Third is a problem that's best described with an example, and as this is a meeting that involves the LIDO working group, I hope you didn't think you would get away without seeing a big slug of XML on the screen. If we consider for a moment a museum with some really good, well broken down requirements data, say for visible light exposure, that requirement can be expressed as a string, that the maximum light that the object should be exposed to is 225 lux, no more than 12,600 lux hours per week. It can also be expressed as a set of different measurements, i.e. pairs of values and units of measure. So one for the maximum visible light exposure, 225 quantity lux unit. One for the maximum cumulative exposure, and I've dropped the details of that from the slide so that it's actually vaguely legible. And one for the maximum cumulative, one for the maximum cumulative light exposure, and one for the duration over which that maximum exposure is measured. In this case, it was a week. Now we need to group these three different measurements together because they all relate to one requirement described in that string, 225 lux, no more than 12,600 lux hours per week. We can group them together easily enough. The event object measurements element can contain multiple measurement sets, and we can use a display object measurements element which will hold the string. But what we also need to do is identify what kind of set of measurements we're dealing with so that systems importing the data know where to put it. Now, this is because we need to try and fit in with the higher level conceptual model that underpins LIDO. We also need to consider how easy it would be to process records. And we also need to place the information in a sensible place in the LIDO document, which is arranged hierarchically, that is above the data that it classifies. After much discussion and sharing examples and use cases, the LIDO working group has therefore agreed to assign a new attribute to the high-level units of information that contain individual measurement fields. So in this case, the LIDO working group accommodated our needs by adding a new attribute in a new place. Finally, there's the question of terminology. As Regina mentioned, the LIDO data structure relies upon descriptive terms to indicate what information particular areas of the data hold, and these rely upon controlled vocabularies. And we need to agree which particular terms we will use for our EODEM record. Now, LIDO, as Regina said, has its own vocabulary, LIDO terminology, which is particularly important when identifying events. And we therefore needed new terms to describe our loan assessment events. And the LIDO working groups already added several draft terms for us. They have also added a new facet for our new type attribute in event object measurements. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say something about how our collaborations help both the EODEM and the LIDO projects. There are three main benefits, I think. First, EODEM has helped us make the next version of LIDO better by enabling it to record more information. Second, the LIDO working group has been given a focused use case to help inform their decisions. And third, we can now be certain that EODEM data will adhere to the LIDO standard and will be valid. And so I'd like to finish by saying a big thank you to Regina and the LIDO working group for their help.